So I just want to start with introductions to the panel. Everyone's on my left, because you all know who Sunand is. So on my immediate left is Richard Powell, who is Executive Director of Grosvenor, Great Britain and Ireland, and seems to do everything in Grosvenor outside of Mayfair and Belgravia, including my neighbourhood, Bermondsey. So I've got a very close eye on Richard. So thank you very much. We've got Yolande Barnes, who is, like Richard has spoken at the NLA so many times. She leads the incredibly titled World Research Team at Savills, and focuses on a range of things that you might imagine is inside that, especially urbanism and mixed-use development, commercial, residential, the whole gamut brought together. Really important commentator on this, as is Olly Wainwright, who you will all know from his Guardian journalism, but has had a grounding in a lot of the stuff we're talking about today, because Olly was actually at the Architecture and Urbanism unit of the GLA, which became Design for London, which is now the sort of the people from the Design for London team are the ones that have been behind this, the secretariat behind MDAG and this. And again, I pay tribute to all of their work. And last but absolutely not least, Jeremy Grint from the London Borough of Barking, who's been there for 7 years, is it, Jeremy? Sorry, have you been? A lot longer, but you've been head of a lot of things for some time, including the physical and economic regeneration in a lot of town centres and brownfields, so Paul's lots of the elements that we're talking about today. And one of the most critical aspects that has been coming out in all of our work is the role of the boroughs and planners, and the issue about capacity, more of which in a moment. Now, you'll see from what Sunand touched on, which was the tip of the iceberg, that we packed a heck of a lot into a tiny report. And you can imagine, therefore, the type of conversations that have gone on. We're now going to hear from our expert panel on their views, having had a sneak preview, and obviously Richard was involved in it, so I won't kick off with you. So, Yolande, would you like to start on your views, please?
Gosh, I thought I had thinking time there. Yes, I think this is a great start, and oh dear, I seem to be causing feedback. A really great start if we think about what a city should look like, and we look at cities right across the world. Of course, a city is much more than just its buildings. And I think when we've looked at the design issues around London, the focus has been very much on buildings. So I think it was great that you mentioned, for example, affordable commercial, and you mentioned a word that's very rarely heard, which is neighbourhood, and thinking a bit more about neighbourhood densities. However, I think there's a lot more to be done in that area, because unless we actually think about what neighbourhoods in London are going to be like, we're not really capturing what it's going to be like to live in London, because none of us live in just a building. We live in a place, and we rely on all the activities and human life that goes on in that place to give us our quality of life. And when we're looking across the globe at where the talent in Generation Y in the tech industry, for example, is going, it's going to really good places. And sometimes those places are really small. So London, big mega global city, is actually now competing with Austin in Texas, Berlin, Tel Aviv, and Dublin, for example, much, much smaller cities. So we can't rely on this size, this huge sort of magnetism, this critical mass for continued growth. It has to be about quality of place. So we need to think, when we're thinking about design, I would argue, very much more about whole neighbourhoods. And what I think is very interesting is that the neighbourhood density you gave for Islington, you only get to 180 units per hectare, or people per hectare, sorry, if you only look at the area of land that is built for domestic dwellings. If you look at all the land, so everything that's open space, commercial space, all the other stuff that goes on in the borough, the population densities are much lower. And I think we have to very much think about how we both accommodate all those other uses as well as the housing, and think about density in much less of a site-based, sort of very narrow way. The other point that I wanted to make is that it seems to me this argument always comes back to land. We know from work we did with London First, we've identified a very similar pattern to you, that most of the low density is in the outer boroughs. We reckon that if densities were just tweaked to normal levels everywhere, I say normal, but average levels everywhere, levels suitable for that particular neighbourhood, then there's scope for 1.4 million new homes. So you don't even have to look beyond the green belt. But of course, you said, I think probably understatement of the day, the political issues in developing suburbia, where 1 million of that capacity is, are just enormous. And I think we have to look at how we can use commercial and market forces and land values to incentivise land release, rather than looking at this as if we can provide the land, because it's the land that holds things back. And I think those blobs are very interesting. It would seem to suggest that you have to give 10 times the permissions on land in order to get the delivery you want. And I think that was a really interesting point, that, boy, do we really have to think differently and imaginatively about land release here. And I think hopefully we'll hear more about the sort of mechanisms we could employ for new landed estates to manage that release, maybe in public, private and third sector.
Great, thank you. Olly.
Thanks, Pat. Well, I'm a bit worried because I'm probably invited here to be the naysayer and say this is all a load of rubbish. But I have to say, it's unlike any other kind of document to come out of one of these bodies. It doesn't have the usual generic platitudes of, tall buildings should look nice and be in the right place. It's a lot of common sense and a lot of kind of straightforward points that I think any new mayor would do well to take up as kind of central parts of their manifesto. So first of all, congratulations to MDAG and the team that have worked on it. I think the most important recommendation is probably one of the humblest, which concerns a sheet of A4 paper. And it's actually a really radical proposal to redesign the planning notice, which, if you think about it, is the main interface between the general public and this enormous amount of growth which is going to happen until 2030. We're going to have to add, I think it's a town the equivalent to the size of Bath every year between now and 2030, which is an unimaginable prospect. And the kind of first impression most people get with that is this crumpled sheet of paper at the bottom of a lamppost. Doesn't even have a picture of what the development's going to be. And there's a very straightforward thing in this book which says, actually, how about having an image of the development? How about actually making this 3D model of London, which exists in the realms of expensive visualization companies? How about having that accessible? The amounts of times I've tried to have a 3D model on the Guardian's site, and it's just impossible because these copyrights are split up between so many different people. Why not have a publicly accessible model that shows the cumulative impacts of this development? I was shocked to learn that most boroughs don't even have such a thing in-house, so there's no way they can assess the combined impact of these buildings. I was very pleased to see viability raises its ugly head in this document. I don't think the document goes far enough in actually kind of pulling viability out of the shadows. I think it should be taking on all of the points that were raised by the mayor's planning group, that they recently wrote a letter to Boris kind of unpicking exactly how viability assessments should be made public, how we should be using existing land value rather than market value in the equation. I think you need to be much more specific on the issues of viability. I think it's a welcome point that Section 106 agreements again should be brought out into the light. I think we've reached a point now where development's become so combative. The amount of emails I receive from community groups with a kind of increasingly lynch mob tone, casting developers as the real villains, and then at the same time developers being increasingly hesitant to actually show what they're doing for that very reason. The more we can make the reality of development transparent, so make page 46 of this book, a building-sized billboard to actually show that creaming off the fat of of private development is what's paying for public infrastructure, given that all that money's been taken away. As soon as people understand that, as soon as the equation is laid on the table for communities to see what the benefits of this growth might be, then I think that level of animosity will be reduced. So another key point in this document is about bringing consultation, forward much earlier in the process, rather than it being this kind of tick box exercise of presenting a finished design and a beauty parade to vote on. It should be an open dialogue where you come to the community much earlier on. Lots more things to say, but we'll get on to that in the discussion, so I'll leave it at that.
Thanks very much. Jeremy.
I totally agree with a lot of what Oliver says there, and from a local authority, but I just want to say a couple of things from a local authority perspective, because Sunand actually highlighted one of them around building as well. And my first bit is about, so it's just worth saying, so I come from East London borough, suburban East London borough, is willing to build 35 to 40,000 new homes in a predominantly two-storey environment. And so there are all sorts of issues about scale, congestion, demand for services and loss of jobs in this process in a place like Barking and Dagenham, and that will be in other places in London as well. And it's somehow about how do we actually deal with those particular issues. And one of the things is particularly about looking at doing residential development with workspace, and there's some issues there about how institutions look at that as a potential investment. But it's absolutely critical. We're going to lose 117 hectares of employment land and lots of jobs in that process, but we've somehow got to replace them. The other bit is all about infrastructure, and the key bit here is we've got an example in Barking and Dagenham of a scheme, a very big scheme, which has been on the books since 1990. There's very few homes being built so far, and all of that is all about the infrastructure, and it's about transport infrastructure and when that transport infrastructure is going to arrive. So when we talk about 35,000 new homes, we can go and put lines on maps and say, oh yeah, it's all going to happen here. But unless that infrastructure is committed at the right time, very little is going to happen. And so that then raises some issues about having a strong partnership between the GLA, TfL and the borough about how all this happens, and also about getting some agreement around priorities. Because in the end, and some people may disagree with me, but we are competing. There are a number of opportunity areas in London which all need infrastructure, and in a way we're all competing for certain pots of money, and somehow someone needs to prioritise some of this. I think my second point is around local authorities building again, and I'd wholeheartedly agree with the principle. In Barking and Dagenham in the last 5 years, we built 1,000 subsidised rented properties, but we are now at a point where we're struggling to do this at the moment, and this is all tied up with changes in the way the government's affected affordable housing delivery by reducing rents for council housing, so that's affected our estate renewal programme. The lack of grant towards rented property, that's affecting our ability to build. And then the third point is all about construction costs. And basically, at the moment, we cannot get affordable rented property to stack up. So we're now thinking, well, okay, we may need to move into shared ownership or for sale type things, but this is really, really out of our comfort zone. And then we've got austerity hitting local authorities like mad, and then local authorities saying, well, we've got to generate income. One way of generating income is through renting, is through providing rented housing. However, if you can't get it to stack up, that's not going to work. So there's a whole bit there about, well, what do we do about the construction industry? Because currently in a boom time, we cannot afford to be building affordable homes. So there's some big issues there from our point of view and from local authority perspective.
Thank you very much. Richard.
Just to give some flavour of the work that Sunand led, I think we probably ran about 6 to 8 workshops with drawing people from all different walks of life. I think I was one of the only sort of private sector delivery people, like developers in the room, so I did try and come at it from a different perspective to try and influence it. And I'm really pleased to see that a lot of that was taken on board and actually featured in the report. The 4 subjects which were picked up are not trying to solve all the problems of the world, but I think they go quite a long way to prioritising what we do think is really important to tackle. And I was interested in Daniel's comment, which I'd also picked up about good growth. You know, we specifically called it good growth as opposed to growth at all costs. The trouble with coming last is I'm probably going to repeat, but I just want to put some of the areas which I felt really strongly about as we went through. The first point that Oliver picks up about communication is I think that historically we really haven't got across to those that are affected the issues and potential benefits from development. And whether it's planning notices or just the form of communication or planning meetings, which are different in every London borough, the ability to actually influence that, or to understand it first and then to influence it, is really broken. I just don't think that system works at all. I think there are some more enlightened developers who are actually taking that on and doing sort of proper exhibitions and proper engagement. But it's not the norm, it's the exception. And page 46, thanks for the reference. How is it funded? How is all of this, how does the economic model for development work? If all the argument is about is I'm not going to be able to park my car outside, that's the wrong level of arguments for what I think is coming out in this report, which is London's growing. The other thing I was really keen to get across, which comes out really strongly, is not just about residential units. I get quite frustrated with this debate about we need more residential units, we need more houses. Actually, the social infrastructure that's needed for the population growth, the workspace, the retail space, the education, etc., is equally demanding on the land and equally demanding on the neighbourhood. And they already feel pretty stretched in this city in lots of spaces. So how do you bring that all together rather than just having a plan for residential units? I sit on a board called Cambridge Ahead, which is the sort of London First equivalent of in Cambridge. And a lot of these issues are actually very similar in Cambridge: affordability, land release, pressure on the green belt, etc. And I feel that a lot of this focus is on how do we densify the centre, unlock the outer, not put pressure on the green belt. But I think this debate is actually broader, and that the wider southeast is affected quite substantially by what's going on here. And whilst this is the London Mayor's Design Advisory Group, it's hinted at in here, but another form of development is what is happening in Basingstoke and Harlow and Cambridge and Oxford and these other sort of towns which you're seeing quite a large exodus of families, etc. I think that's always been the case. But those statistics, I think, are a feature of the thinking associated with what's happening in this report. I think just to finish on my points, really, is this issue about how do you fund it? How does the economic model work? It's not just about describing, but if we believe that page 46 is broken, if we believe that that is not going to throw off sufficient surplus to fund all the facilities that we need for this growth, what's the alternative economic model? How do we change it? We're very alive to this debate about existing use value versus market value of land. There aren't many levers on the current system, so is there a different system? And if we believe those bubbles, and the big bubble that housing is the most, is the highest profile issue, well, maybe there should be a complete shift in the economic support from central government or local governments or other forms for that particular need. But I think that slide in particular will run and run. I think there's something to play with there.
Great, thank you very much. There was a lot of common threads there, you know, and Yolande picked up the importance of neighbourhoods and all of that, which goes with that, not just social infrastructure, but managing the public realm, creating public realm, all of which adds to the cost. And as Richard and everyone else has said, that is then placed on the developer. And it's great to hear you, Olly, talking about the importance of communicating this, because we're going to be tapping you up to be one of our people who can do that. Thank you. Sunand, would you like to comment?
Yeah, thank you. Great comments. And to start with Yolande's, of course, this is one of 4 reports. The next one will deal with public space, with neighbourhoods, and the following one with the ageing London, the fact that actually the fact that people are living longer. It's not just that London is aging. People are having longer lives with more quality time in their lives. And that's a fantastic resource for London. And that goes back to the neighbourhoods and the role that a longer living population can play in making neighbourhoods. I don't think we've really got our heads around that yet. That as much as a third longer, and very many years after so-called retirement. And I think this is a new landscape, and we haven't quite grappled with that. And it goes right to the heart of the question of neighbourhoods and the quality of place. Completely agree about the problems of the potential densification, not a great word, but of suburbs is best unlocked through incentives in terms of value and the commercial advantage of judicious development in suburbs, rather than simply saying that there's some kind of political. The density of the suburbs was set partly by the Tudor-Walters report and by the fact that actually they were deliberately built at that density as an antidote to the density of central London. So that legacy is there with us, and but of course now it becomes enshrined as a private right to kind of space and views. And I think what we have to show is how that private right isn't the only way to have a good life. And I think that in a way we're almost victims of the success of Metroland and its very clever campaign. On the blobs, you said the 10 times permission. Actually, one thing I would like to ask you, I've got questions for each of you as well, is that what is going on? Why is, despite this huge demand, why are the numbers what they are? You said that it looks like 10 times as many permissions in the pipeline are needed to generate the numbers delivered, but that isn't the causal link necessarily. It suggests to me more that there are other barriers in between. I would love to hear on the econometrics of all that. With Olly, I think that Olly's kind of put his finger on it, which is that we don't have the answers. Things are bust. Richard, who spends his time building homes and neighbourhoods and so on, if he says that actually we need some real rethink of the economics and planning system, then it does mean that it must be. Therefore, if Richard says it must be true, is what I'm saying, really. But we're not here to necessarily answer that. We're saying, let's actually, before we get to that, let's start by just being facing up to what is really there. And that's why the transparency, the communications, the engagement from more people asking questions and being well informed to ask questions is the place to start. And that's kind of, we've seen that as our role. And of course, the same in terms of the sheer frustration of the difficulty of it goes with the cost of building today. In the NHS, 1/3 of capital projects were stalled as of last year because of the incredible price inflation from the end of 2013. 31% increase in the cost of building in London in 2 years of those kinds of buildings. These things happen, and of course, in the longer term, they balance out. But locally, it feels, like I can sense your difficulties very, very easily. And you're talking about some way of prioritizing infrastructure demands because the pot is limited. But then the question, of course, is the limitation of that pot serving us well? Is it possible to invest in infrastructure in a slightly different way, so that we reap the rewards in the future? And how can we think long term about infrastructure and make the investment now to make that happen? Richard is part of the gang, so I think he's summarised all those problems, and I come back to the fact that he's talking about the one point he made about the wider region and the impact all round, and we can't really think of this problem in isolation.
Yolande, would you like to pick up?
Yes. I think we don't realise, sitting here in London or in the UK, just how absurdly reliant we are on very, very few methods of delivery when it comes to housing. The delivery model is completely dominated by a very short-term set of builders, and I'm not knocking them. They're the only show in town, so we've got to stick in with them. But the more I look at this, the more the problems seem to revolve around the constraints that are imposed by a speculative house builder having to make a return on capital employed on an annual basis for shareholders. Now, in other countries, there seem to be many more longer term players, particularly landlords, but also out and out developers who will simply retain an interest in land and an ongoing involvement in place, I suppose a bit like the Grosvenor. And then there's a whole area which we just keep ignoring or getting the wrong end of the stick with, I think, which is that in virtually every other Western country I've looked at, an average of 50% of housing is delivered by the people who will live in it. Now, that doesn't mean they're eco-warriors putting hay bales on top of each other or, doing a grand design. It's just very ordinary people self-procuring custom-built housing, rather than relying on a speculative house builder with all that marketing sort of infrastructure. And that seems to actually deliver extra houses. That seems to be an additional route to market that actually increases the capacity for people to build. At the moment, and this is very clear, a colleague of mine, Neil Hudson, has done a lot of work on this. We only seem to be capable in the UK of delivering each year 1/10 of whatever is turning over. So the speculative house builders are market takers. They're totally reliant on the state of the market to control how much they deliver. And in London, added on that, you've got so many constraints. You've got such scarcity value of land. The price of land is so high. They're completely concentrated in the upper price brackets. And the huge sort of shortfall, forget social housing, is just a mid-priced open market housing in London. So yes, the models, the business models, if you like, at a very big level are absolutely behind the peculiarities that we see in delivery. But unpicking them requires extraordinary vision and breadth of knowledge, which very few people in the policy-making environment, in my experience, have.
And would that be something you would want to see taken forward to a future mayor? That breadth of vision, that bravery? We have a tendency to be very short-term. We look for short-term solutions rather than long-term solutions.
Well, of course, when we're talking here about mayors, if you're talking to national government, you're talking to ministers, where the vision is 5 years. Some may argue maybe 9 years now, but nevertheless, this issue is 50 years in the making. I think there's a huge case for treating the built environment like infrastructure and saying, look, this is bigger than all of us. This is longer than most of our working lives. It has to get out of that political cycle and into a kind of 50-year investment programme.
Jeremy, can I bring you on that? Because it chimes with what you were saying in your introductory remarks as well.
Well, it's very interesting because we get a lot of investors wanting to talk to us about, so there is presumably, and Yolande would presumably agree with me, there are a lot of people around at the moment with money that they want to invest long term. And it's the tricky bit though is because we've said, oh yeah, we've got all this land, except it's got something on it. So actually what these people are saying they want is something, either they want it all cleared and they want planning consents in place, or they actually want some buildings actually built. And so there's a slight time gap about, so for us it would be, well, is anybody willing to put money out for 5 years before they'll get anything back? And that's the bit that a lot of these people are struggling with. Well, actually, we haven't got many who've said they're willing to do that. The other bit is there are some very big housing associations out there now who are definitely moving into this arena of long-term investment, long-term management, and delivering schemes over
So
there is something there starting to happen.
So a lot of this comes down to patient capital as well, doesn't it? The sort of the King's Cross model that everybody puts up as a good model. So so this also takes us to the priorities and viability. And you talked, Jeremy, about how when there's opportunity areas actually competing for funds, how do you prioritise? There is a limited amount of money, and frequently they look to developers, everyone looks to developers to fund that. So what's your solution, Richard, to the problem that you posed earlier on viability?
Try not to stitch me up, Pat. Let's throw some ideas out there which are I think in the discussion zone anyway at the moment. That last point about investors, the type of long-term investors, the type of patient capital, very competitive rates, want certainty. They don't want uncertainty. If it's uncertainty, they'll price a risk and therefore they'll want a higher return. So I don't think there is a shortage of money at all. I think it's the categorization of money. So, for example, one of the most important features I think that national, regional and local governments is taking on the burden of releasing land, potentially securing vacant possession with the powers it's got, and then capitalising, i.e. taking the risk and taking the return commensurate with that. I don't think it's working with the private sector doing that, and I'm not sure they're very good at it. The idea of custom build is very interesting, but most of the custom build schemes abroad rely on the state to fund the infrastructure. So this whole thing about if you do 9 units, you don't fund affordable housing, we've got to be a bit careful about that, because the burden then always comes back to government to solve all the problems. I think that a third idea, which is to a degree you've been talking about for a long time, Jeremy, is that the local authority is effectively pre-purchasing homes on schemes for its own use, whether that's discount market rent, social for rent, or all forms of different tenure. One of the funding solutions, one of the de-risking solutions is actually the local authority or government actually pre-purchasing. So rather than off-plan sales in China, they're effectively off-plan sales to government. And if there is a release of funding into this infrastructure need, i.e. housing, then maybe that's better than trying to create lots of development companies within local authorities from scratch for the local authorities to go and develop loads of housing. There's a broader discussion there. I think the final point, which is perhaps a little bit broader than this conversation, though, is a conversation which is going around at the moment, which is a wholesale collection of foreign investment into some sort of a collective investment scheme to create a residential fund. It's a bit broader, but we are in a world at the moment where there are a lot of headlines about foreign investment and anonymous people buying homes in London, etc. Rather than cut that source off, why not use that source as a giant fund, just like we would do with infrastructure, to fund this other infrastructure problem? And I'm really taking this point that is a way to try and treat it, to take it out of political cycles. I will come back to this point about the page 46. If that doesn't work in all circumstances, some circumstances, I'm not sure, then let's try and explore some other ones.
Thank you. In a moment, I'm going to open it up to questions from the floor, you, in fact. But before I do, I just want to come back to Olly. And you spoke so eloquently about the importance of really bringing the community into the conversation, enabling them to understand the page 46, as it will be known as forevermore. What a lot of this comes down to are really strong partnerships between the public and the private sector. But where that has existed to bring forward development, like Lend-Lease and Southwark at Elephant and Castle, you've given them a really hard time. So, could you unpack that a little bit, please?
I think at the moment, the problem with this document partly is that it treats the status quo as a given and says, given this slightly rubbish situation that we're in, here are some ways of making it a bit better. It almost needs some slightly more radical thinking injected into it. And I would say, Yolande hit the nail on the head when she said that we need 10 times the number of planning permissions if we're going to rely on the market bringing forward development. And the solution is we shouldn't be relying on the market. And Lewisham is doing this very brave experiment. I don't know if there's anyone from Lewisham Council here, but reviving, the methods of Seagull, from the 80s, but bringing back a community land trust model, which they managed to prove through public procurement was the best value use of this piece of public land, long term. So they had private bidders going up for this thing, and they could say, actually, by giving the land to the community, we've got social investors that are funding the infrastructure costs over, the next 30, 50 years. This is the best value use of the land, and it retains affordable housing, which will be affordable forever. So I think we need to be encouraging more alternative models like community land trusts. They don't need to be self-build. I think it's a mistake to always combine the kind of hair shirt self-buildy culture with community land trusts, because they're two very different things, and it puts off a lot of kind of hard-nosed, commercially minded people when they think it involves building your own house. It doesn't. Community land trust is a separate model. Lilac in Leeds is a very good example, actually, of how a brave local authority, kind of gave the land over to the community for long-term benefits. So,
thank you. Well, let's crowdsource some alternative models then. You've got the platform in order to do that. We'll go to you in a second. I just want to give a plug. A lot of what has come through today is about the time to have conversations, to consult, to work with people, and that takes, whether you're bringing in developers to have conversations from the local authority side or developers wanting to talk to local authorities, to think about that place, and that takes time, it takes people. And the last of the reports that we'll be publishing, I think, is one of the most important underpinning factors of all of this, which is how we can actually bring more people into the public sector in order to actually build this vision, create all the communications and all of the associated policies that we've been talking about. So that's in 4 weeks' time. Book your place now. So any questions from... Yes, I'm going to take 3 and in one go. So here, and there. And I'd like you to say who you are, who you represent, and if you need to address it particularly to a panel member. And then panel members, we need to be really brief to get lots of questions in.
This is a general question. My name is Claire Richardson. I'm an architect. I have a particular interest in creating successful communities. There's been a lot of talk about how we get people to engage, local people, ordinary people to engage in this process. I just wondered whether there'd been given, some thought had been given to neighbourhood plans, which after all are intended as a democratic process for people to engage in what's going to happen with their communities. Are we assuming here that they have no value, that they could be set aside, or that they would simply have to be renegotiated?
Great. Neighbourhood plans, thanks very much. Oh, behind you, yeah, great.
Hello, Ian McChesney Architects. Spain has Barcelona, Madrid. Germany has Munich, Berlin. Holland has Amsterdam, Rotterdam. Should we not be looking beyond London? We've had a very lively devolution debate with the Scots. My practice works a lot north of Watford Gap, in places like Middlesbrough, where there's a huge depression. Shouldn't we be looking to perhaps set up another sister capital?
Thank you. And over there, Peter.
Hello, I'm Barry Sellers. I'm a member of the Urban Design Group and also London Borough of Wandsworth as an urban designer by profession. Certainly support Richard and Yolande in their what I would call, in some ways, perhaps a stronger and longer vision for London. I think certainly our way in which we do our decision making is far short term. And the other thing I'd also advocate is a bit like we're doing with Crossroad in terms of front-loading public transport infrastructure decision making. We have to front load it and capture it through SEAL. I think it's fundamental in order to enable a much more sustainable way in which we're going to develop. The only thing about Crossrail I have a question mark over is London's probably the only city in the world that you can't have double-deck trains, simply because the tunnel dimensions for Crossrail and even Crossrail 2 will not allow that. So if you build it one more metre, you could future-proof London from that point of view. But I think I certainly agree with the panel here in terms of that the stronger and longer vision for London.
Super. So that's neighbourhood plans. Should we be building a sister capital? We are the Mayor's Design Advisory Group, though. So even though I'm from Liverpool, sorry, it's
Which
London. And then the short-termism and front-loading infrastructure. Do you want to pick up on neighbourhood plans?
Yes, we haven't gone into specifics, as you can see from the report. That would be a vehicle for engagement. We haven't given it any specific thought, but thank you for your thought.
I think they don't have enough teeth. I approve of neighbourhood plans in principle, but the fact they can't actually contradict anything that's already in the local plan, I think I'm right in saying, makes them slightly ineffectual. And also the way they're organised tends to be geared to a certain kind of person that's already actively engaged in the planning process. So I think we need to be addressing actually more the kind of market machine and how to engage people in that, rather than this kind of fringe activity of retired evenings and weekends planning enthusiasts, personally.
Great. Jeremy?
I just add one thing. I don't disagree at all with the principle, but in local authorities in London struggle to have any planners. So you actually need some people to actually help provide and develop neighbourhood plans. We just don't have anybody. We're basically talking about getting rid of our planning policy people and just having people who deal with planning applications. We just can't afford it.
Come here on 4 weeks' time. Okay, so Yolande, head of the world. So do you want to talk about sister twins?
Yeah, I think the whole idea of neighbourhood planning is a very interesting one in a global context, and it very much plays into this community engagement. So much of what is called consultation is actually just telling people what's going to happen or what they have to fight against. And one thing that strikes me, the more I look at different places, especially urban places, is that when people are left to their own devices, they build actually very good urbanism, the sort of urbanism we all like. I mean, medieval Florence was once what we'd call now a shanty town, and I've got very interested in slums, not because I like the idea of poverty or lack of sanitation, but because what people build when left to their own devices is recognisable by any human in any culture anywhere in the world. And through history, through millennia, we organise ourselves pretty much in some pretty dense, efficient ways when left to our own devices. And I think we've got to trust people a lot more to produce good city. And what seems to have happened over the 20th century in London and very much elsewhere is that we've stopped mixing things up. Because if you go to any favela or a shanty or squatter community, what you'll tend to find is a very simple series of buildings on streets, very well networked streets, which consists of a sort of public space on the ground floor where...
Can I stop you there, because we need to get some more questions in. I love your thinking, but I'm going to ask, I think that's a discussion over coffee. I'm going to ask Richard to come back on the capitals, the twinning issue, please.
I think that if you speak to Jackie Sadek, that's exactly what she's trying to do through devolution, i.e. to create new mayors, new metropolitan districts. Whether it's a capital city, I think the intention is to power up cities and to give them critical mass and allow them to have greater spatial planning of the city, how the education structure works, etc. So I'm not sure I'm in a fan of just saying, let's go and create another capital city, but I am massively a fan of, let's try and power up these cities, these additional cities, and put some infrastructure around them.
Thank you. Sunand, quickly, and then we'll another round.
Just one thing about the sister capital. It came up in the very first round table about actually dealing with all of this in a UK-wide way. Fact is, London is not just a UK capital. London is a world capital. It actually has taken on a form which is quite beyond what we've ever really recognised before, and I think that almost makes that issue impossible to tackle.
Can I just add that I think moving Parliament north would help. There's a debate if we should be spending how many billions on refurbishing that old museum. Move it to Bradford or somewhere like that.
Have it a travelling
powerhouse.
Make a travelling Parliament,
like they did with the BBC, and everyone spends a fortune travelling to London. But, it's worth a debate. Okay, 2 quick fire questions. If anybody can ask a question really quickly, you. Okay, thank you very much, Simon. Have you got a microphone? And is there another question that we can line up?
Yes, hello. Simon Khan. Qualitative assessment, that's great. Yesterday I seem to recall hearing that there's a plan to build 2 tunnels under London and numerous fly-unders and other road building schemes. How does that tally with the work that you've been looking at? Or is it just happening in another part of the TfL jungle?
Right, we'll take the question over there, and then Barbara can ask a really quick question, and I just want to say, Barry, that I took your question as a point, really, because we're completely with you.
Okay, Dieter Kleiner from RCKA Architects. Actually, it was just a very quick... Dieter Kleiner from RCKA Architects, very quick question, actually. It was really picking up on Sunand's comment earlier about an ambition to capture the increase in land value. You kind of just made that statement. I'd be really interested to know how you thought that was possible, actually.
Okay.
Great, and Barbara?
Thank you. Barbara Weiss, architect, and also from the Skyline campaign. I'm very interested about the political sensitivities about building in the suburbs, which are actually a huge percentage of what London is. Everybody's terrified. You mentioned Greenbelt and people go into spasms of horror. You can't build on the Greenbelt, but the river has been ruined and the skyline is being ruined. And I think we have to try and find the balance between choosing what we're doing and where we're doing it. I just wonder if you could comment on that.
I am going to exercise my chair's rights to say we've got 4 minutes to end, but the report, I would say, Sunand, wouldn't you, that the report is there as a contribution to that absolutely vital conversation, because if we open that up now, I think we won't let these people out of the room for a long time, because it is so important, Barbara. So I'm sorry to be bossy, but Sunand, do you want to talk about tunnels?
So very quickly, first of all, when you say another part of the TfL jungle, we are not part of a jungle or of TfL, and well, possibly jungle, but we very much have liaised with TfL colleagues, but actually this is not a policy statement. These are the recommendations of people who are voluntarily part of the Mayor's Design Advisory Group. So I think can I just bat that away. The capture of land value is about infrastructure, and of course actually what some of the things that Richard and Jeremy have said already cover that, which is that when disposing of or using, should we say, publicly owned land and giving permission, which is going to increase the value of land through development, how can we find a mechanism where we can capture that value in order to upfront invest in infrastructure? Because the investments in infrastructure are paralyzing the system. It's stopping us doing all sorts of things, and it comes back to the long-term, short-term issue. And the future capture of land value through there are many mechanisms that have been posited. Many people criticize them, development taxes, land value assessments, rates, and so on. But we need to keep on trying to find a way of squaring that circle.
Thank you. I'm going to ask our panel members if they want to make like a 30-second statement to sort of sum up on what they want out of this, or any comments, quick comments on the things we just had, and then I'll draw this to a close. So, Jeremy?
Well, I'm just going to quickly comment on the infrastructure and things. Stamp duty uplift or stamp duty on new developments, on major new developments to go towards infrastructure. The Mayor's asked for that in relation to some things so far, but you could do it on everything. I think that sort of ties into that. I think that political sensitivity is very critical, and it's interesting to note that lots of the opportunity areas are all areas where there's industrial land or rail yards, and they're not really in the places where it would be politically sensitive.
Thank you. Olly?
I think a land tax is the answer to that question. And I think it's the answer to so many questions, that replacing all these other things like council tax with a tax on land value. It's the only way to stop London's values spiralling ridiculously out of control, retain value for local authority. Another option would be, as Bob Colnett has suggested, who's the expert on viability, for local authorities to take a stake in development, so they have a percentage of the uplift of any project if it's on public land. So I think that's essential for the way of kind of getting the public sector to retain some of that, cream off some of the fat that the developers are making from those projects.
Yolande?
Hugely more diversity in the way we release land, including local communities with owner-occupied land, and a wider variety of business models, timescales, sources of capital, and players, just get more players into this area than we've got currently, which means the whole industry needs to start thinking more imaginatively, more diversely.
Richard?
We set out on this journey to focus some efforts of a really inspired team to come up with some recommendations. They're probably not all right. They're part of a debate, but actually what they are focused on is a bit of a challenge to the next mayor to say, what are you going to do about it? And here are some ideas that will hopefully guide you as the next mayor to improve the city. So we are really looking forward to how they're adopted.
Absolutely, which is why, sorry, Barbara, for cutting you off, but it's actually how, this is a debate. I think I wanted to end, you've done my summing up perfectly, thank you. Yeah, I wanted to end on some of those points, and this is a process. This isn't a static document. This has to now go forward and have conversations. It needs to go to the mayoral candidates, but it has to go to the likes of Richard and Yolande and all the local authorities, because we're only going to do this in partnership. And I think one of the most important words that has been used today is latterly by Yolande, which is the word trust. And there's so little trust in all of this. And I know that's what Olly talks about when he writes. And ultimately, people think that they're being rolled over, but the reality is that most of us are actually just getting up every morning early to come to breakfast events and put time into things like this because we want to make a greater London. And we don't want to screw people's quality of life, quite the opposite. So the communication, the consultation, the long, patient approach to developing these neighbourhoods and communities is what we have to move on to next. And I think that is, for me, the most fundamental part of building a great capital. I once heard Anita Roddick say, we advertised for employees, but people came along instead. And we forget that at our peril. We are planning for people, we are planning for ourselves and for the people who will come after us. And that's what this report is about. And I thank you so much for your time today, and everybody that's put effort into this. NLA for hosting us and shepherding us along the way, and all the team at the GLA, MDAG, Daniel, etc. And you, the audience, let's go forward and do it. Thank you.